As an icon of American comic books and pop culture as a whole for almost a century, Superman is undoubtedly the most iconic superhero ever made, and one of the most iconic characters in fiction in general. I mean, let's be honest, when someone tells you to think of a superhero, this guy is probably the first one who comes to mind for most of us. Ever since his debut in Action Comics #1 back in 1938, Superman has continued to be a dominating force in most mediums he's featured in, whether that be amazing animated shows or classic movies. It's really hard to argue with anyone who sees Superman as the definitive archetype of the modern superhero. With this many years of history, it's inevitable that there are some parts of Superman's timeline that have been buried by the sands of time across the wide variety of mediums that the character has appeared in. And since I'm still on a high having seen James Gunn's Superman for the 4th time in cinemas, and it giving me the Superman movie I've been wanting for years, I thought it would be a great time to take a look at some of the lost history of Superman and dive into some of the projects involving the Man of Steel that weren't preserved over the years or failed to make their way to fans like you and me in general. So prepare to look up and join me as we take a look at 10 pieces of lost and cancelled Superman media. Genndy Tartakovsky's Superman. Perhaps best known as the creator of his shows on Cartoon Network, such as Samurai Jack and Dexter's Laboratory, Genndy Tartakovsky is a well-known animator within the film and TV industry, revered for his unique animation and art style that often included very little dialogue and focuses on action and visual storytelling. Most of his previous work has received acclaim from critics and audiences alike, also receiving numerous awards, which makes it all the more disappointing to find out that many years ago, Tartakovsky was actually developing a project based on Superman for DC Nation, a programming block that aired on Cartoon Network from 2012 to 2014. As the name implied, DC Nation was dedicated to showing all manner of DC animated shows like Green Lantern the Animated Series and Young Justice. Alongside the full-length shows, DC Nation also aired some shorts, and Genndy Tartakovsky was developing a Superman short for the block in 2013 alongside background designer Scott Wills and production designer Justin Thompson. Unfortunately though, the block was cancelled just a year after development began, resulting in this project being cut short just as it had entered development. Very little is known about what the story of the short itself contained, and we only have small glimpses of it from some sketches of Superman that Genndy posted to his Instagram account, as well as some concept art posted by Scott Wills. These give us some idea of what the short would have looked like visually, and man, even for concept art, these look great. Superman's costume looks to resemble the suit used in the classic comic story Kingdom Come, with the black background as opposed to the traditional yellow used on Superman's chest emblem, and the design for Superman's character model, proportionally, looks like it resembles a lot of Tartakovsky's other work. As the short was cancelled, it isn't known if any animation was completed on the project, or if any other concept art of it exists. I'm doubtful much else was completed for it, since Scott Wills said that it was cancelled just as they were starting work on it, and it hasn't been mentioned much aside from when the artwork was posted by Genndy and Scott, so there aren't many details regarding its development outside of what I've shared here. As a huge fan of his work, I'd have loved to have seen this short brought to life. I think Genndy's talent for short-form storytelling and his super unique animation style really could lend itself well to a great Superman short, but since it was cancelled, all that remains of what could have been an awesome Superman animation is some stunning artwork that gives us a look at what could have been one of the most striking and visually breathtaking interpretations of the Man of Steel ever put to screen. Sunman. Sunman is an unreleased video game that was in development for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in the early 90s by developer EIM and was to be published by Sunsoft, who published several games based on DC characters in the 90s, most notably the various games produced for Tim Burton's 1989 classic, Batman. The gameplay of Sunman is very similar to the two Batman games Sunsoft made for the NES, those being Batman the video game and Batman Return of the Joker. In the game, the titular Sunman can run, jump, punch and duck, just like Batman could in the Sunsoft games based on him, with the addition of being able to fly when the player pushes up on the D-pad. The game also features side-scrolling levels, where the player can fly around and shoot heat vision from Sunman's eyes, with there being 5 stages in total, each made up of 1 to 4 areas, with a boss at the end of each stage. If it somehow isn't blindingly obvious based on the footage you're seeing on screen, and based on the game's logo, Sunman was originally developed with the intention of being a Superman game, as confirmed by the game's director, Kenji Eno, who claimed that DC rejected the game as Superman can't take damage and die. There is even a prototype version of the game that exists that features the first 3 levels with Superman's sprite in place of Sunman's, and with a chip-tuned version of John Williams' iconic Superman theme instead of the score used in the final game. This prototype version that features Superman's sprite cannot be played from start to finish, as it breaks when you beat a boss, requiring players to use the stage select code to reach the next stage. Thankfully though, despite the fact that the game was never officially released, there is a ROM available for the complete version of the game after it was reworked from being a Superman game into being Sunman. The ROM for this version of the game was released alongside the original Superman version by The Lost Levels, a website that specialises in finding, archiving and releasing unreleased and prototype versions of games, and unlike the prototype featuring the Superman iconography, this version of the game is essentially complete and can be played from start to end without any issues. From what I could find online, it isn't known why the Sunman version was never released, as no one involved with its development has ever mentioned why, although it isn't hard to guess. It's likely that Sunsoft thought the game wouldn't sell as well without the Superman license, and decided that it was more effort than it was worth to promote and release this version of the game. Even when developing the version of the game that featured Superman, I don't know if I necessarily buy the director's claims that DC rejected the game as Superman can't take damage and die, as there were other Superman games released prior to this that allowed Superman to both die and take damage, such as Taito's arcade game. If I had to guess, I get the feeling that Sunsoft probably began developing the game before they'd finalised getting the rights to Superman, and as they'd already made games based on Batman at this point, they probably thought it was a given that they'd get the rights to Superman. When DC didn't allow them to use Superman, they repurposed the game so that their work didn't go to waste. Even though a complete version of the game featuring Superman was never officially made, as it was cancelled before it could be completed, in February of 2014, a user by the name of Pack and Sack Dave released a ROM hack that was a full Sunman to Superman conversion. This ROM hack converts all of the sprites, cutscenes, and the title screen to those of the Superman version of the game. With this ROM hack, we now have the closest thing to what the complete game would have been like if Sunsoft had finished it off with the Superman license, but unfortunately, we'll likely never see an official release of a complete version featuring the Man of Steel, since whatever is available from this game and its time in development is already available to the public, and it doesn't look like much more was made of an official version. The Superman, 1933. To most fans of the character, the first appearance of Superman that they'd be most familiar with would be the now infamous Action Comics #1, which was published in 1938 and, of course, has gone on to become one of the most coveted comics ever made due to its historical significance. While this is without a doubt the debut of the version of the character we all know and love today, this wasn't actually the first version of the character to appear at all, as it took Superman's creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, a few goes before they landed on the version of the character we're familiar with. Prior to the release of Action Comics #1, there were actually 2 known appearances of Superman, both from 1933. The first was a short story titled The Reign of the Superman, which was published in fanzine science fiction The Advanced God of Future Civilization #3, man that's a mouthful, in June 1933. Outside of the name, everything about this story was practically unrecognisable from the final version of the character, as the titular Superman was a villain and not a hero, and he had telepathic powers as opposed to all of the powers that Superman would normally have. While still very rare and hard to come by, with a copy selling for over $40,000 in 2006, The Reign of the Superman is preserved and readily available online, which can't be said about the second known appearance of the character, which was somewhat closer to the final version. Titled The Superman, this comic came after Siegel and Shuster decided to toy with the idea of making their character a hero instead of a villain, leading them to create a new story which they took to a publishing company called Consolidated Book Publishing. While seeming enthusiastic about the story initially, Consolidated Publishing eventually pulled out from the offer, which frustrated Jerry Siegel. The duo then took the book to various other publishing companies, all of which rejected them, which further enraged Siegel, causing him to throw the issue into a fire, burning what was perhaps the only copy of this insanely important part of comic book and pop culture history. As of 2025, the only surviving image we have of the comic is its front cover, which shows the character of Superman, who is shirtless for some reason, diving towards a criminal. There's very little known about the plot of the comic, and the only information we have on it comes from Siegel and Schuster themselves, who say that Superman in this story wasn't an alien from Krypton, but was instead a human crime fighter who prowled rooftops and wore a bat-like cape. Which, that definitely doesn't sound like another hero that DC created, which we may or may not know about. Over the years, various Superman collectors and comic book historians have spoken to a multitude of sources who have claimed to have a copy of this story, although nothing has come of these, and if I'm being honest, I kind of doubt anything will. Considering this comic is almost 100 years old, it'd already be hard enough to find, but the search for this is complicated even further by the fact that the comic was never even officially published to begin with. And given that the only copy known to exist was burned by its creators way back in the day, it may be a sad case where this one remains lost forever, and this very important piece of comic book history never sees the light of day. However, the cover for it did survive, so there is a chance that we may be lucky, and one day the comic might surface so that we can see the story that paved the way for the world's first mainstream superhero. Superman Family. Pitched to Warner Bros. By longtime animation artist and director Vinton Hook, Superman Family was set to be an animated series that, as the title implies, would have focused on the Kent family. Hook came up with the idea while working on Season 3 of Young Justice, drawing up some rough pitch art based on the popular Superman Rebirth comics, with the idea being to fuse stories from the, at the time, newer comics with concepts and stories from the older Silver Age comics, as Vinton felt that DC needed something that went back to the company's lighter tone roots, as opposed to the more adult-oriented stories that DC was known for at the time. Warner Bros. Liked the idea, and paired Hook up with visual artist Sean Galloway, known for his work on the Spectacular Spider-Man, to come up with some artwork to get a feel for how the show might look. Sean drew art that showed various characters such as John Kent, Damian Wayne as Robin, and a female version of Steel, but despite the art looking pretty good, and ideal for a kid-friendly series based on Superman and his family, WB ultimately passed on the project. The artwork we have available now, which was released by Sean Galloway, is all we have now that gives us a look at what the show might have been like, and based on just the art style, it looks like it could have been a pretty cute show for younger audiences. An example that Vinton gave for a scenario that we would have seen in the show was seeing how Superman's son John and his wife Lois would deal with him being turned into a super merman, so you could tell the show was definitely inspired by some of the lighter-hearted stories of comics' Silver Age. Since it didn't make it past the pitching stage, it's almost a certainty that no animation was done for a pilot of any kind. However, it isn't known if there was any other art created for this show, outside of what I've shown in this video. Vinton would later go on to work on the Harley Quinn animated series that aired on the short-lived DC Universe streaming service, and his concept for a Superman Family animated series has remained shelved to this day, with the artwork giving us our only look at what could have been. Superman 64 Lost Content. Now, we've had all manner of terrible Superman content over the years. I mean, we've had terrible Superman movies, terrible Superman TV shows, terrible Superman comics, but I don't think there's anything that's quite as undeniably or objectively awful as the 1999 abomination of software design, Superman: The New Adventures of Superman, more commonly referred to as Superman 64. Developed by the French studio Titus, Superman 64 is widely known as one of the worst superhero games and one of the worst video games of any kind ever made. Anyone who's attempted to play this thing, myself included, can tell you that it is one of the worst things a human being could possibly experience, with horrible graphics even for the time, horrible controls, confusing levels, and of course, the infamously awful levels where Superman must fly through rings in order to complete the stage or get to the next objective. because as we all know, if there's one thing the Man of Tomorrow is renowned for all around the world, it's awkwardly flying his way through rings placed around a virtual city by Lex Luthor. And while it might be hard to imagine this game as anything other than a horrendous failure of video game design, there was actually one point in development where it might not have been quite as terrible as the version that was released in 1999, as the game was initially developed as something completely different before having massive changes made to it in order to rush it out for release to coincide with the final episodes of Superman the Animated Series. The information about this lost version of the game comes from Titus co-founder and the game's lead developer, Eric Kane, who revealed that it was initially much different. He originally envisioned the game as featuring a wide open sandbox set in Metropolis with real-time strategy elements. However, only a few days after Titus had finalized the deal to develop the game, the Warner Bros. Licensing team underwent massive changes in management, and the new people in charge weren't exactly fond of the project. Their first suggestion to Titus was to redesign the game to be similar to SimCity, with Superman as the mayor of Metropolis to avoid him engaging in any action. This idea was rejected by Titus almost immediately, and the game's development quickly turned into a mess, with executives from DC turning down almost every idea from Titus, with the rationale that it would be out of character for Superman to do any of the things that Titus suggested. It got so bad to the point where Titus had to provide documentation from the original Superman comic books to prove that their approach to the character was in line with what was seen in those comic books. As a result of this change in leadership, several changes were made to the original version of the game to portray Superman as positively as possible. As they didn't want to entertain the possibility of Superman being able to harm regular people in an open sandbox version of Metropolis, Warner Bros. Forced Titus to change the open world Metropolis to a virtual version of the city created by Lex Luthor and Brainiac. Other changes included the ring sections present in the final game being moved from being only tutorial stages to being a major part of the game, and the removal of destructible architecture. The conflicts between Titus and Warner Bros. Caused the game's development process to go on for such a long time that Titus didn't have time to address any of the bugs or issues present in the final version of the game, with Nintendo even stepping in to try and provide technical support to Titus. This would be in vain, however, as the game would still be released as a broken mess, and the content that Eric spoke of in this interview would go on to be lost forever. We do have a small glimpse at what could have been for this game though, as a beta build of this earlier version has surfaced, and it gives us an idea of what this better original version could have been like, with it taking place in the real world as opposed to the virtual world, and with different controls and mission design to that of the final game. Perhaps the biggest difference between this version of the game and the final version was there being none of the ring missions, as it seems like a little more thought went into designing the missions that are featured in this beta version. It really is quite staggering just how different this version of the game is. It is currently unknown if there were any other more complete builds or development materials in this early version of the game, as nothing else has surfaced beyond the beta that we have. The content available in this beta build was likely only the tip of the iceberg too, as Eric said he wasn't allowed to give much detail on what exactly was removed, as he almost definitely signed some sort of NDA with Warner Bros., meaning the rest of the plans for the lost content of this game will likely remain a mystery. And in some ways, it really sucks that this is the case. While I definitely wouldn't say the beta build is a good game by any stretch of the imagination, it most definitely has a lot more promise than whatever they were trying with the original version, and considering it's based on what is, in my opinion, one of the best Superman adaptations with Superman the Animated Series, it's a real shame that we won't get to see this version of the game in a complete state at any point. With that being the case, we'll just have to wonder what else could have been for this game, as its final version lives on as what may be one of, if not the single worst piece of Superman media ever made. Superman 5. Before the release of the notoriously awful Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, Canon Films, the production company responsible for that monstrosity, and who owned the film rights to Superman at the time, were planning on making yet another sequel, and based on their previous film, it likely would have been just as big of a catastrophe as Superman 4 was. Known only by the simple working title of Superman 5, there is very little information available online about what Canon Films had planned for this movie, and the only evidence I could seem to find that proves that it was ever even planned in the first place is an advertisement card that has a preliminary logo for the film. However, after Superman 4 and a string of other failures, Canon Films found themselves in hot water financially, and the Superman film rights thankfully reverted back to Alexander and Elias Salkind, the previous owners to the film rights of the Superman character. After this happened, the idea of a fifth Superman film starring Christopher Reeve in the title role was disregarded until writer Cary Bates, who was incredibly familiar with writing the character, being the longest running writer in Superman's comic book history, came up with an idea for a new version of Superman 5 and pitched it to the Salkinds in 1991. Bates's version of the film would have ignored the events of Superman 3 and 4 and would have featured Brainiac, a villain many fans, including myself, have been waiting a long time to see in a Superman movie, fighting Superman in Kandor, a bottled city that was spared from the exploding planet Krypton. And while this sounds like an incredibly promising pitch for a fifth Superman film, much like Canon Films before them, the Salkinds found themselves in financial trouble in the early 90s after another film that they were producing, Christopher Columbus: The Discovery, ran massively over budget. This led to the father-son producing team quitting the film industry in general, causing the film rights of the Superman character to revert back to Warner Brothers, who decided to go off in their own weird and wonderful direction for Superman for a while. Regarding Bates's version of Superman 5, there isn't any sort of script available for the project, as it was only pitched to the Salkinds and never actually got off the ground past that stage, so we don't know if he had anything else planned for the film beyond what was mentioned here. A few years after Cary Bates pitched the idea to Warner Brothers for Superman 5, Christopher Reeve would unfortunately suffer a horse riding accident, which left him a quadriplegic, effectively ending any chance of a sequel starring him in the title role. Although years later he would return to acting in another Superman project, playing the character of Dr. Virgil Swan in Smallville. As far as the sequel to the original Superman movies that starred Reeve, it would take some time, a recast, and a new director to give us Superman Returns in 2006, which, ironically enough, much like Bates's idea, serves as a direct sequel to the first two movies, while ignoring 3 and 4. And while it's a perfectly fine, if not slightly dull film, I would gladly trade it any day for one more film with Christopher Reeve as Superman, with a better script than the last two films he starred in. I'd definitely take it as a last appearance for him over whatever the hell they tried with this. Oh, I hate this movie. Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, deleted scenes. While we've had a load of different versions of Superman in a wide variety of mediums, arguably the most iconic adaptation of Superman outside of the original comics is the 1978 Richard Donner classic, Superman the Movie. Starring Christopher Reeve as the Man of Steel, the film isn't just one of the most iconic superhero films of all time, but one of the most iconic films of any kind ever made, proving the viability of the superhero film genre and catapulting the character to even bigger levels of success than ever seen before. And while the original film and its sequel are often hailed as classics, the two Superman films starring Christopher Reeve that followed Superman 1 and 2 were both ripped to shreds by critics and audiences, with the fourth film often cited as one of the worst superhero films ever made. Released in 1987 and titled Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, this fourth and final film to star Christopher Reeve in the title role follows Superman as he takes it upon himself to destroy all nuclear weapons, while Lex Luthor creates Nuclear Man, a superhuman entity that is strong enough to fight Superman. The film suffered greatly from a massively reduced budget compared to its predecessors, and this, combined with a lot of studio interference and an unwieldy script, caused Superman 4 to turn into both a critical and commercial failure. But would you believe that despite how messy and unfocused the final film was, there may have at one point been an even more convoluted version of Superman 4? This is because a lot of the footage shot for the movie ended up on the cutting room floor, with the last cut of the film that test screened to audiences before its release containing 45 minutes more footage than what was contained in the final film, before being completely ripped apart in the editing room to place more focus on the action and to try and streamline the plot. Over the years, bits and pieces of the cut footage from the film have resurfaced, with a large majority of the film's deleted scenes being made available through the 2006 Deluxe Edition DVD. However, there are still some scenes that are missing and not known to the public. Some of the big changes and deleted scenes that were made to this version of the film that are known include an opening scene in which Clark Kent visits the grave of his adoptive parents, Jonathan and Martha Kent, a montage that used new and repurposed stock footage to show more of Superman's escape from Krypton, an entire plot thread where Lex Luthor creates a version of Nuclear Man, played by Clive Mantle, before the final Nuclear Man played by Mark Pillow in the final film, and a different ending where Superman takes a boy named Jeremy, who plays a much bigger role in the deleted scenes than he does in the final film, for a fly around the world. There were way more scenes than just the ones stated here. I mean, it was 45 minutes of cut footage after all, and the removal of these scenes likely had a massive impact on the film's plot and story. While a lot of the scenes can be viewed on the DVD release of the film, the scenes that do remain lost live on in a variety of ways outside of the footage shot for the actual film. This includes some production stills from various scenes, parts of the film's comic book adaptation that give us a better look at some of the film's deleted scenes, and the novelization and script, both of which contained the scenes that were shot but were never released. Likely due to just how awful the film is, there doesn't appear to be a lot of demand for finding the lost footage from Superman 4, and even though I'm doubtful anyone really cares to see much more from this movie, the lost media hunter in me is curious to see these scenes found and released someday. I'm interested to know what the 45-minute longer cut that was shown to the test audiences was like. If the final film is as awful as it is, it really does make the mind wonder just how bad that cut was that made them want to cut it down even further. I mean, let's be honest, it's a pretty fundamentally flawed film from the word go, with how awful a lot of the writing and plot elements are, but how much worse and more convoluted could it have been with the addition of this footage? Unfortunately, we'll be left guessing, as the cut footage likely remains in a vault somewhere at Warner Brothers, and much like the audience, they'd probably rather forget this film ever existed to begin with. Jack Kirby's Superman. Perhaps most famous for being the artist behind some of Marvel's most recognizable characters such as Captain America, the Fantastic Four, and the X-Men, Jack Kirby is widely regarded as one of the most influential comic book artists of the golden and silver age of comics, making massive innovations in the way that comic book art was created. Kirby spent a large amount of his career at Marvel Comics, and as stated, he was largely responsible for a lot of their most famous characters, but in the early 70s, he felt that he was being treated unfairly by Marvel, feeling underappreciated and undervalued, which caused him to quit his job at Marvel and jump ship to their longtime rival, and of course the owners of Superman, DC Comics. While at DC, Kirby would go on to write and draw the art for a huge storyline called The Fourth World. The story would have massive implications for the DC universe, introducing some of its most important and iconic characters, including Darkseid, who has gone on to be a fan favourite of many fans. Being as big as it was, The Fourth World spanned multiple comic titles, one of which was Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, a comic series that, as the title implies, focused on Superman's colleague and good friend from the Daily Planet, Jimmy Olsen. Naturally, working on this series would involve drawing Superman, and that's where our piece of lost media begins. Despite initially being reluctant to draw a character that he did not create, Kirby did create art of Superman for his appearances in the Fourth World story. However, upon showing this to executives at DC, they did not approve of the changes Kirby had made to Superman's design, such as redesigning the S emblem on his chest, and ordered longtime Superman artists Al Plastino and Murphy Anderson to draw over Kirby's original artwork, rendering most of it lost to the public. Thankfully, some of Kirby's take on Superman has been preserved, with unused sketches being available online, and some panels in the final comics featuring artwork reminiscent of Kirby's style, but unfortunately the redraws on his artwork were done prior to the comics being published, so most of his art of Superman has gone unreleased. We do know that some people working for DC at the time, such as Kirby's then assistant Mark Evanier and future New Teen Titans and Crisis on Infinite Earths writer Marv Wolfman, had seen the original sketch work that Kirby had completed for Superman, but it is currently unknown if anyone working for DC at the time is in possession of any of the original sketches, or if they sit somewhere in the DC archives. I'm honestly not sure if it's even known exactly how much art Kirby completed of Superman before it was redone by DC, but I for one would love to see more of Kirby's art of the character. I mean, the guy's a legend of comic books and is responsible for so much of what made a lot of the art in the medium so popular today, so seeing anything more from him would be great, let alone art of his interpretation of Superman, who could be argued as DC's greatest hero. Alas, until someone is able to unearth the sketches that Kirby completed of Superman for his Fourth World storyline, we'll have to enjoy what we have of one of the most iconic comic artists' take on DC's most iconic superhero. Blue Steel, the cancelled Superman video game. For many years, a lot of people have asked the question, why isn't there a Superman game on the same level as something like the Batman Arkham series or Insomniac's Spider-Man games, and I've often wondered the same thing. Why have we never got a really good Superman game given how iconic and popular the character is? I mean, he is one of the big three superheroes, so why has he never gotten this treatment? Well, this entry gives us a look at a Superman game that had every intention of being just that for the character, but was cancelled due to unfortunate circumstances. All of the information we have on this game comes from Twitter, where in 2021, the game's lead designer, a user named Salvatrix, revealed several details of the game and its time in development. Known internally as Blue Steel, this video game was in development in the late 2000s for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 by game studio Factor 5, famous for their work on the incredible Star Wars Rogue Squadron series of games. It was initially planned to be released as a tie-in to the also cancelled sequel to Bryan Singer's 2006 film, Superman Returns, before shifting direction to be based less on the movie, releasing as more of a companion piece to the film's release. The game would have placed a big focus on aerial brawls and destructible environments on a scale that no game before, or according to Salvatrix, after, has ever fully delivered on, and would have avoided relying on the usual fare of making Superman fight robots or being weakened by kryptonite, instead pairing him up with enemies that were of similar strength to him. The setting in the game also wouldn't have been limited to just Metropolis, with plans for parts of the game to take place in Smallville, the ruins of Krypton, and Apocalypse. Visually and tonally, the game would have taken inspiration from the DC animated universe, specifically Superman the Animated Series, with the action, or as Salvatrix puts it, super brawls, being inspired by the action scenes in Justice League Unlimited. She even uploaded a compilation of clips to YouTube that was made during the game's time in development to help set the tone for the game and its action sequences. Alongside this, she also uploaded various pieces of concept art that showed Superman with some of the villains that were planned for the game, such as Doomsday, the Parademons, Livewire, Darkseid, and a few others. This concept art looks really cool and gives us an idea of what some of the action and visuals of the game would have looked like. Perhaps our best look at the game comes from a couple of videos that Salvatrix uploaded to her YouTube channel. The first video shows this footage of a 2008 prototype build for the game running on the PlayStation 3. It shows very blocky and generic placeholders in place of most of the models and gives us a look at the actual gameplay of Superman flying through the city, running through the street and fighting some generic looking enemies, while also showcasing the destructible environments that were described in her Twitter post. The second video shows a target render which was created during pre-production to show what the gameplay might be like, with visuals closer to what the final game was expected to look like. And I know it's just supposed to be a prototype that isn't actual gameplay, but man, this looks great. The action with Doomsday and the destructible environments looked like they could have been a ton of fun if fully realised, and it looked like the vision for the game was headed in a positive direction. And while that may have been the case for some time, due to the 2008 financial crisis, the game's publisher, Brash Entertainment, went out of business. This took its toll on Factor 5 as they were unable to secure funding for the project, and by October of that year, they were no longer able to cover the payroll, at which point development on the game quickly fell apart, causing it to be cancelled. Factor 5 closed only a few months later in May of 2009, ending any chance of this game seeing the light of day, which does kind of suck to be honest. I mean, who knows if it would have been any good, but based on the videos and what Salvatrix has stated about its development, it sounds like it would have been an ambitious game that took inspiration from some of the best depictions of Superman outside of the comic books. What I've discussed here is really only the tip of the iceberg, and Salvatrix wrote a whole article detailing the game's time in development, which I'll link in the description for those interested. Unfortunately for us fans though, we'll likely never know for sure just how good this game could have been, as no playable build was ever made publicly available, and we'll just have to keep waiting until a talented developer makes the truly great and definitive Superman game that we all deserve. Superman Flyby. Over the years, there have been a whole host of cancelled Superman films, most of which were in development after Superman 4 essentially killed the Superman film franchise before it was brought back with the 2006 release of Superman Returns. The most famous attempt to revive the Superman film series after Superman 4 was a Tim Burton-helmed Superman film starring Nicolas Cage as Superman, titled Superman Lives, which I feel like a lot of people are already aware of. Heck, he even showed up in that 2023 abomination of a film known as The Flash, so I thought it might be more interesting to take a look at another Superman film that almost got made before being cancelled and eventually being replaced with Superman Returns. Titled Superman Flyby, the film was envisioned as a total reboot of the Superman film franchise penned by J.J. Abrams and would have acted as an origin story for a new version of Superman. Ideas for the film included a version of Krypton that was besieged by a civil war between Jor-El and his brother, K-Zor, Lex Luthor being written as a government agent obsessed with UFO phenomena, and Clark Kent revealing himself to the world as Superman, bringing K-Zor's son, Ty-Zor, and 3 other Kryptonians to Earth. The film would have seen Superman getting killed, after which he visits Jor-El in Kryptonian heaven, with Jor-El having died earlier in the film by suicide while imprisoned on Krypton. Superman is then resurrected, returning to Earth and defeating the 4 Kryptonians, with the film ending with Superman flying off to Krypton, leaving a cliffhanger for a sequel. After Abrams turned in his script in 2002, director Brett Ratner was initially hired to direct the film in September of the same year, with filming being planned to start in late 2003. Multiple actors were approached to play the character of Superman in the film, with stars such as Josh Hartnett, Jude Law, Ashton Kutcher, and Brendan Fraser, among others, auditioning or being considered for the role. Ratner had claimed that casting a famous actor for the title role proved to be a difficult task, as no actor wanted to sign on to multiple sequels. This was despite them supposedly offering the actors huge amounts of money for 3 picture deals, with Josh Hartnett supposedly being offered $100 million to sign on to play Superman for 3 films. They even planned to bring Christopher Reeve on as a project consultant, who felt that Tom Welling, famous at the time for playing Clark Kent on the CW series Smallville, would be an ideal candidate to play Superman in a new film, also stating that a smaller and more unknown actor should play the role, given how much of an enduring icon the character is. Supposedly, actor Matt Bomer, who would go on to voice Superman in the 2013 film Superman Unbound, was Brett Ratner's preferred choice for the role, with Christopher Walken in negotiations to play Perry White, as well as Ratner wanting to cast Anthony Hopkins as Jor-El and Ray Fiennes as Lex Luthor, as he had worked with both actors previously. This ultimately wouldn't matter though, as Ratner would depart from the project in March of 2003 due to arguments with producer John Peters and casting delays. Once Ratner had left, Terminator Salvation director McG had become attached to the project in 2003 and had a sleuth of changes to the original plans for the film from Ratner's vision. This included hiring writer Josh Schwartz to rewrite J.J. Abrams' original script, as well as making changes to the casting of the film, approaching Shia LaBeouf for the role of Jimmy Olsen, Scarlett Johansson as Lois Lane, and the invincible Iron Man himself, Robert Downey Jr. as Lex Luthor. Those last 2 castings are pretty hilarious in hindsight, aren't they? McG also wanted to cast an unknown actor in the role of Superman, having various actors record screen tests for the role of Superman, including Jason Behr, Jared Padalecki, Michael Cassidy, and a little old actor by the name of Henry Cavill, who of course would go on to play Superman in Zack Snyder's 3 DC movies. While he made these changes to the plans for the film, much like Ratner before him, McG would depart from the project shortly after joining, citing budgetary concerns and disagreements with Warner Brothers over where to shoot the movie, as he wanted to shoot in New York and Canada, whereas WB wanted to shoot in Sydney, Australia, which would have cost significantly less. McG initially stated that he felt it was inappropriate to try to capture the heart of America on another continent, so decided that he wanted to shoot in America, but he later admitted that the real reason he didn't want to go to Australia to shoot the film was due to his fear of flying. After McG departed the film, Bryan Singer was brought on board in July of 2004, and he decided to completely abandon the J.J. Abrams and Josh Schwartz script, instead pitching his own story to Warner Brothers, which of course would eventually become Superman Returns, finally putting the idea of Superman Flyby to rest. We do have the scripts for Flyby available online, and having read plot summaries and parts of the script, I'm so glad this was never made. Some of the ideas sound so unbelievably bad and sound like exactly the sort of thing that a superhero movie in the early 2000s, made by a big giant corporation like Warner Brothers, would have tried to do in an attempt to make the heroes edgier and cool. It really doesn't work for me, I'll be honest. I'll leave links in the description to the scripts for the movie so that you guys could give it a read for yourselves and see if you can get any more joy out of it than I did, because, I mean, to me this just doesn't feel anything like a Superman movie I'd want to see. Aside from the script, various production materials such as concept art and images of the suit from the film have surfaced over the years, as well as images from some of the screen tests that were recorded, including Henry Cavill's, although from what I can tell, the actual video footage of this has never surfaced. Interestingly, in August of 2013, Chief Creative Officer of DC Comics at the time, Jeff Johns, mentioned that Warner Brothers was considering turning unproduced scripts and screenplays into original animated films, and had expressed an interest in using the Flyby script for one of these animated features. This of course never came to be, and Johns left his position as CCO of DC in 2018. With James Gunn stating that all live action, animated, and video game content from DC will exist in the same continuity as his new DCU, I don't think there are any current plans to bring back the Flyby script for an animated feature anytime soon. Although, it's not like we haven't seen this sort of thing happen before, so maybe there is a chance that somehow, someday, the sun will shine again on Superman Flyby, and we'll get to see a full realization of this bizarre, yet somewhat intriguing Superman story.
You must have a philosophical grasp of this appeal that Superman has that's more than just a cartoon character. Philosophically, what does Superman represent to people?
A friend, and that's what people really need most. They don't need a strong arm, one-man vigilante force. They need a friend. We're living in an age when people are basically afraid of contact with each other. They're afraid. People live in cities. They don't even know their neighbors. They're afraid to go out in the street. Something might happen to them. Basically, technology is against you. Life is overwhelming. Even the bank doesn't know who you are. And it's like, we run around scared a lot, particularly those of us who live in cities. And America was founded on the virtues of a helping hand, of going 5 miles to lend your neighbor a donkey or whatever he needed. And I think that is that kind of virtue that's at the bottom. That's the heart of Superman. The genuine love of people, and that you always know he's your friend.